Hey guys, Gerald here back again, and I have something a little bit different this time for my channel. So this is a character concept of a Shadowborn that I designed for the Nuadan Chronicles, a tabletop RPG game made by Broken Dice. I'll put up their link in the description so you can definitely check out the amazing fantasy tabletop that they've created for themselves. So they've given me the very nice honor of sharing the workflow or drawing that I did for one of their characters, which was the Shadowborn. And I'm going to narrate throughout the entire sped up video of this concept art. So I did start with a very good written description from them about who this character is and what he represents. So I have kind of a visual idea, at least in my head, what they wanted to see in its design. But it's always best to do a quick line sketch just to see how the visuals correlate with the words in my head. So I like to do this process really quickly and very loosely, just to quickly get a feel of how the proportions and the physique would be for this character. So even though I sketch a lot of forms out, you see me use the lasso tool to reshape the proportions according to how I think it should be for a better balance. So I'm constantly pulling and stretching the limbs or scaling them down according to what I would consider a better ratio of the proportion. So I even use Liquify because I find it a very quick tool and very efficient way of changing your character's proportion without having to redraw the entire design. So I would encourage you to not be too protective of your sketch. It is called a sketch for that reason. You definitely want it to just be a very loose representation of what your final design is going to be. So what you should be aiming for is a nice balanced final design instead of a perfect line art from the start. So because I am going to photo bash over this entire artwork or this entire sketch, the quality of the line art isn't the most important to me. I really just want a good silhouette and a good proportion for me to begin, and maybe a nice stance for the character. So I've lassoed the entire design and given it a nice little silhouette. This helps me to quickly block in these textures of sculptures that I found online that I thought had a good physique and surface information for my character. So I'm using the layer as a layer lock, the silhouette that I cut up earlier as a layer lock, and this allows me to quickly throw in all of these sculpture textures and surfaces and give me a very quick preview of how the final surface is going to look like. So I have a decent folder of textures that I've compiled over the years. They're categorized by creatures, characters, you name it. And I'm just going through my list here and trying to get a texture that I think would be good for this design. So even when I'm designing a quote unquote like a demon or a creature or monster, I do like to start with some kind of animal base, just because it gives me some sense of logic or real world sense for the design to grab onto. Before I start to put in all of the crazy surfaces or fantasy anatomy of fantasy surfaces, it's much better, I think, if you start at the basis of nature to give your design some kind of a foundation. So my workflow for photo bashing is equally frantic, or I would say nonchalant. I personally, believe that a painting should kind of come together towards the end. So it's about the sum of all of the parts as opposed to one particular section. So for me, it would make more sense to quickly block out every surface and every material that I want on this design before I start to commit to render and maybe homogenize the rest of the textures. So that's why you'll be seeing me bounce around across the design like so, because what I'm trying to do is just putting in the minimal amount of effort um, in order to just quickly get the design to come out. So here you can see me adjusting the proportions again. I work by merging all of my layers. I don't really like to keep too many layers at bay, just because I'm constantly changing my design, especially in these early stages. So because mind you, I only have a rough vision of what I want this character to look like. So I'm essentially making this character up as I go. So it's very important for me to remain very nimble and keep my file easy to work with, so I can just freely design and experiment without having the layers holding me back. So now that I think I've kind of reached a close final proportion, so I'm going back to some textures. And one thing I want to stress is that if you notice that the values, I mean, this character is going to be quite dark, but I've intentionally painted his values and his concept to be a little bit darker than the intended color scheme. This is to allow myself to easily add bright values on top of this darker tone. As you can see me using the levels tool to gradually add little light spots. So this is what I call working with a darker or just below neutral, just darker than your neutral tone. It's much easier to add on light than it is to remove light. So I tend to work with these values and then gradually work my way up using the dodge tool and a little bit of paint to gradually bring up the surface. So I would say I'm at the stage where the entire design is starting to come together, at least from a general concept point of view. So I'm just taking a little bit time off, just adding a quick background for the character. For me, sometimes putting the character in a very quick mood or a background like this helps remind myself where this character belongs, what kind of world does this character live in. And even though I might remove this at the end or I might redo it in the end, it does give me sort of a quick preview of how this design might look on screen in the video game or in the film. So you could do it really quickly. As you saw, it only took me a few minutes using one picture, but it really helped me get some context of how the lighting was even going to affect this character. Because working with a pure gray background, even with a gradient, sometimes might be a little less conducive creative wise. So now that I have some base textures blocked out, I'm going in with a paintbrush now and essentially starting to blend all of the surfaces that I put in and try to work in a little bit of lighting. Here what I've done is just cut out the head and neck area, and I'm doing this because I want to put a little bit more care in the portrait. I think good character design has the whole character and costume obviously, but a very iconic or believable face in the sense that it feels like a person staring back at you is really important, even if you're designing a creature. So what I'm doing here by extracting the head is to just force myself to put more emphasis on the portrait design or the face design of this character. So because I've exclusively cut it out, I can now put all of my focus and my creative endeavors just purely on nailing the expression. So in the character write-up of this Dragonborn, Shadowborn, sorry, um, he is quite an intellectual creature. He is strong and dangerous, but not in a sense where it's just blind fury or blind rage. I did want to have a certain level of intelligence in the way that he would speak or act. So for me, getting a nice expression, even if it's just a simple stoic expression, but I wanted the facial features to have that intensity. So I'm using the textures, I'm using a little bit of light, but definitely what I want is that lines on the horn to just flow down to his nose and have like a very sculptural face and a very sculptural portrait in order just to make him look much more regal and elegant, but at the same time still very powerful and dangerous. So I'm jumping back and forth between the paintbrush and photo bashing because, again, for me, it reminds me of sculpting. So I used to do a lot of traditional clay sculpting with Super Sculpey, and sometimes what I'll do when I'm sculpting is while I'm actually adding on clay or removing it, etc., I would take maybe pieces of a texture or a toy and I'll indent that surface of a toy into the clay just to see what kind of surface I create. And for me, photo bashing is very similar. You're kind of indenting a pattern, or you're putting in a surface, and you're seeing how it changes the dynamic of the design or the surface. And you kind of stop there and you work it back in and you blend the surface in, and then you keep going and you keep adding new textures, right? It's a exploratory process of finding the final form based on the core feeling and personality of the design that you're trying to achieve. So I'm really grateful for this picture because I think it really kind of had that feeling of the surface that I wanted. Not necessarily the final design, because if you put those two pictures side by side, there's nothing similar about any of those two designs. But the surface property was something that I thought was quite ideal. And this ram horn, even though it's a curved shape, I could easily stretch it to match my character's more straight horns. But what I wanted was just that noise and those little ridges, and to give something for my artwork to bite into and give it a little bit more fidelity as opposed to just a smooth surface. I'm also concepting the design directly with lighting because I think it's just a easier way for me to see the final output. Um, I do like having some kind of a rim light, especially on the face area. It just makes the features a little bit more readable. And a big part about design is light because all of your characters will appear with lighting. If you're designing something for film or a game or animation, even more so. But so for me, like it makes more sense to think about the form using light. So I'm always using the dodge tool to kind of pick up surfaces that I think want to be raised up, and I'm using the burn tool, sorry, to knock down shapes to kind of push them inwards. Once again, going back to liquify, kind of playing around with the proportions. For me, the spacing of the eye is really important. The shape of the cheekbone and how it cuts into the face is really important. So we're at our 15-minute mark, and mind you, this is a sped up video. So originally this was about an hour and 45 minutes. That was the actual time it took me to concept this character from start to finish. I didn't really think like an hour 45-minute long video was good for YouTube, but if you want that raw video, please let me know in the comments section. I'll gladly just upload it without narration. But I just decided to speed up the whole thing to like a concise 30 minutes because I think it sufficiently expresses like what I'm trying to show workflow wise. So I have this really cool White Walker concept from White Walker screenshot from Game of Thrones, and I think I wanted to use the hair, but in the end, although that was the feeling that I wanted, the texture to me was not working. So this little goat hair texture section I think worked much better because it had the fidelity and most important that subtle rim light, which I think really helped to make the hair look more luscious and real and convincing with the lighting scenario that I have. So I'm scrubbing through my anatomy folders now, trying to see if I can get a good texture for the muscles. Also just cleaning up my Photoshop because I have a lot of tabs open. But for me, you know, you saw me painting a lot the features or certain things about the face because to me that I was actually trying to design something, or it's a new feature. But for something like a neck, I don't really want to redesign a neck. Excuse me. I don't really want to redesign a neck. I think a real human neck is sufficient enough to do its job. So for me, photo bashing a neck in is just makes sense. The only thing I have to do is just to address the lighting inconsistencies that are on this photo because the lighting is different, the angle is different. So I just didn't make those small tweaks and of course adjust the complexity of the surface. So in this case, I'm just adding a little bit of noise patterns just to make the skin shimmer a little bit more convincingly. So if you're ever doing a character concept, I would highly encourage doing a little cross or call out of the head like this because the good thing is, like, especially once you're done, you can just implant or just scale down this big head and put this onto your character like what I'm doing now, and you automatically have a much more higher resolution head area for your character concept, and that kind of just gives you a really good place to start thinking about the polish level for the rest of the character design. So in this final 10-12 minutes of this sped up version, I'm gonna just use photo bashing and just fleshing out the detail and resolution. For me, the design phase is done. I'm happy with the design. I'm probably not going to change it that much. So it's important that to know like what stage of your artwork are you at each time. So if this is a 30-minute video, it took me roughly about 10 minutes or 30 minutes of real world time to finalize the design, another 30 minutes to finalize the head, and then a final 30 minutes to add detail to the rough concept that I did of the body earlier. So it's not so much like how long or fast I did it, but it's about knowing what kind of mindset to carry at each stage of your artwork. Because if you're constantly being indecisive throughout your whole process of making the artwork, it's going to make the whole process of designing very, very intense and laborious because you're constantly changing and constantly updating. And to me, that eventually creates quite a bit of fatigue, design fatigue, or whatever you want to call it. So it's actually both important for me from a practicality standpoint, for me to design at a certain period, and then I'm gonna tell myself, hey, I need to stop designing now. I need to move on. I need to start committing to a render. So it could be 30 minutes or it could be 3 days, right? But it doesn't really matter. The point is, when you're designing, then just keep it rough. Don't try to polish it yet. Focus on the idea, focus on the feeling, focus on the big story and personality of the design. Don't worry about finishing. Don't worry about details. Don't even worry about lighting for that matter, right? Because you're trying to solve design. How does this design help my story? How does this design complement the feeling that I'm trying to achieve? And however long it takes, even though you're only left with maybe a rough artwork, but at least design-wise, you're locked. And once your design is locked, you can set a new set of time to polish it up. And when you're polishing it up, you're just focusing on the core fundamentals of art, which is form, shape, lighting, texture, perspective, etc. Right? You're not jumping back and forth with design anymore. You're just purely thinking about, okay, how do I make this look real? Or how do I make this look convincing? Or how do I make this look visually finished? And that's what I'm doing right here, right? So in this short video, I hope that that message kind of conveys through, because especially if you want to be a concept artist, finishing is not always the priority of the artwork. To be honest, I would say it's quite a low priority, because everyone is more interested in the story and the design and the feeling that you're trying to get across. I would say maybe only if you purely are focused on the illustration aspects of things, then it would be an equal parts, so maybe a higher part of fidelity and finish versus the design and idea. So I'm kind of I'm taking a break from the finishing part of the design a little bit and just messing around with the layout, moving things around with my pieces of artwork here. I'm a trained concept artist, so layout to me is a really, really big part of how I like to submit my artworks. I feel like a good layout is tantamount to a good packaging. It's kind of like when you buy a new toy. Opening that box up is about as important as the actual contents itself, right? The packaging or how you plate a well-cooked meal is as important as the flavor, the taste, and the texture of the meal itself. So you'll see me messing around the layout as much as I'm actually painting the character. Because for me, layout adds appeal, plus it adds clarity, right? So any additional clarity I can add to my design is going to be a win for me, because my client is just going to understand my design so much better. And when my client understands my design, the chances of them giving me a good feedback, either an outright approval or a positive feedback helping me push the design forward to a direction that they want, is going to be higher. It's going to be better. So for me, communicating the idea across as best as I can is my kind of main goal of creating my concepts. So here I'm starting to kind of flesh out the sections that I was sort of not really putting too much care, the abdomen. I'm using a lot of this rim light actually to quickly build up form without having to paint too much. Because for me, detail should be where the light hits. So if I tell myself first where I want the light to hit, and in this case it's this little rim light that's coming from the top left plus a really soft light coming from the top right, it automatically tells me like, okay, these areas I want to put on more texture resolution. I want to make sure the silhouettes are good, and I want to make sure those little rim light sections have nice form and nice silhouettes and some clear shapes. So I'm loosely fleshing out the lower half, and you see me progressively getting lower and lower. So I started with the head and I moved on to the shoulders and chest, and then a little bit of his arms, and etc. So I'm gradually going lower and lower to the character. Why? Because to me that's where the audience eyes are gonna go to as well. People look at characters from the face down. So I need to make sure that the detail level from the face down um, is also equal importance. So higher detail on the face, and then gradually I'm going to reduce the percentage of detail as I go lower and lower. So to me, this is a great way of optimizing my time. Obviously, in the ideal world, I would love to just render everything, the entire character. But you know, being a concept artist, your days are limited, your hours are limited. So if my time is finite, but I want to get as much designs out the door as I can, I find that this way of prioritizing how much you detail, how much you flesh out, going from the top down, is very practical. If I'm designing a vehicle, it would be usually from the cockpit area or the head of the vehicle moving outwards. And if I'm designing an environment, it would be usually the focal point of the environment, be it an altar or the center hallway. So that area will have the most fidelity and it will gradually bleed out. So if you imagine if you're designing a detective's room, then the detective's desk would be the highest fidelity, and then the walls and the areas, the cabinets and shelves and the things surrounding that desk will gradually get lower and lower fidelity. And honestly, I think it makes better pictures sometimes because your eyes aren't bombarded with too much detail, and it makes it actually much easier to see what's actually important about this piece. So if you look at the feet of this character, it's essentially almost a silhouette. His hands especially are almost just silhouettes with really, really little lighting and texture. But it's intentional because I don't really want to flesh those out late this much yet, at least not at this stage. What would normally happen is once a concept like this gets approved, I would do external callouts, similar to what I did with the head, where I'll paint the detailed version of the hands, detailed version of the legs, to make the 3D modeling process, for example, easier. So finishing touches, I'm just adding a drop shadow to the character. Once again, presentation to me is really important. So having a good cast shadow will make my character feel so much more grounded, more physically in place, and it actually makes it feel more real, even though honestly the resolution and fidelity of this concept is rather low. But because the lighting and the background, the way that the lenses are affecting the background, making it blur, and all the values are working together, to me makes it feel like it's a real picture, it's a real scene, it's a real character standing in front of you. And to me, that's why I think it, even though with a lower resolution, it works. So I'm basically at the final stages of the piece. I'm just doing some cleanups to my document, my layout, and I'm probably just gonna add some minor atmospherics to just kind of continuously add more depth and volume to the scene, and also just, you know, playing around with little small presentation tricks that I like to do. Smoke for me is great. Easiest way to add depth and volume to the scene. So finishing touches, what I like to do is usually add a little bit of color adjustments, auto tone, auto contrast. I will also add a little bit of a value adjustments using levels just to balance everything out. Final liquefy, final dodge and burn, right? Because the entire canvas needs to work together harmoniously as a layout. And I would also like to hit it with a little bit of a unsharp mask, usually just to punch up some of the textures, make them a little bit more consistent, and also a chromatic aberration pass using the lens correction adjustment tool, as you can see here in Photoshop. So by nudging the channels, the color channels, you're gonna get what we call a chromatic aberration effect. And that always makes it look nice and real. So final touches, a little bit of adjustment and balancing. So I hope you enjoyed this almost like a speed session of me trying to talk for 30 minutes straight. Here's the final artwork and all in all its glory, I hope. So please do check out the Nuadan Chronicles. They're doing something really amazing with fantasy tabletop games. Myself and my team illustrated a whole number of their key characters, or iconics as they call them. And this is a little snippet of how I created one of the characters in this amazing franchise. Oh, I call it a franchise, the start of this amazing franchise. So this is Gerald signing out. I hope you have a good day. Please like and subscribe if you think these videos are useful. Thank you for your time.